joined now by Dan Greenburg of Barstool Sports. He's joining us for the Boston Celtics for the alley-oop. Dan, we're doing trade deadline stuff. The trade deadline just passed this afternoon, and boy, howdy, was it a fun one. Even for the Boston Celtics, who didn't have a ton of flexibility, obviously, but they make it work and add a couple young guys, and should be interesting to see. Did this meet your expectations as a Boston Celtics fan?
I think mostly. I think most Celtics fans, there were two real positions I think we all wanted Brad to explore, and that was big man depth and wing depth. And with Xavier Tillman, it's a guy that is an elite defender based on metrics and everything you hear from the Grizzlies side. Didn't cost anything really to get him. I mean, Lamar Stevens is an end of bench guy who wasn't even really playing. Right. I don't think any Celtic fan cares about second-round picks right now, given that they're in a title window. So that, I think, checked an important box. The Jaden Springer this is your 15th guy on the bench, right? They swapped him for Danilo Banton, who wasn't ever going to play any sort of meaningful minutes. The same is probably going to be true for Springer. So I wouldn't say it exceeded expectations because they haven't, as of this recording, addressed their reserve wing depth, but there's the buyout market for that, and they didn't stand still. Brad has made a trade every trade deadline and every offseason since he's taken over this job, so he's not afraid. If he sees an area where he needs to improve his team, he's going out and he's doing it. But we have to see it on the floor, right? I mean, it's all great in theory, but they're not in a situation where they can give a half a season for Xavier Tillman to get up to speed. If you get hurt or if you need him right away, like when you join this team, you need to be able to pick things up quickly and you need to be ready to go from day one. So we'll see.
I'm curious to see how it goes, but I want to circle back. I think Brad Stevens rules. I think that he's dope. I think that exactly what you want from an executive, because he's got the mind of a coach and he understands what a coach is going to need in a lot of these situations. And what do you need for a team that has everything in Boston? Well, you could get an extra energy guard, somebody who's going to provide a little bit of defensive burst. And I think somebody like the Boston crowd is going to be very, very excited to really root for a guy like Jaden Springer as he gets up to speed in all those moments. And then you need some Al Horford insurance is probably the other thing I'd say. Al Horford, Kristaps Porzingis insurance, where those guys are like, one, Al Horford is just a little bit older, obviously, but two, Kristaps is still an injury risk. So getting a guy like Tillman, I think, just makes a lot of sense, especially if you believe that, hey, maybe Joel Embiid comes back, maybe you face Nikola Jokic in an NBA Finals. Like, you need another body for those guys, because seeing the Celtics kind of go up against those guys, it's pretty scary. Sometimes we don't have all of the, you don't have all the bodies to throw at them. So I thought that it was a great move, and you didn't have to give it up anything to do it. So really, really excited for the Boston side of things. Like, I think Brad Stevens is great.
He's honestly, as good as he was as a coach, it's like it doesn't even come close to what he's doing as the boss. Yeah. I think, like you said, he has that coaching experience, and right away from day one, he basically undid every mistake that Ainge did in his final two, right? He got the job, he traded Kemba out the door. He got if you're an undersized point guard, get out. Like, unless you're Peyton Pritchard and you can shoot 40% from three, we're not interested, right? You have to be able to switch. You have to be, you have to fit a certain mold. And I think these two guys fit that mold, right? Like Xavier Tillman, you mentioned Horford and KP insurance. It's a little different because he's nowhere close to the offensive player those guys are.
No, not even close.
He doesn't stretch the floor. He can't make his free throws, but he can switch and he can guard pretty much like he can guard your small ball four. He can stay in front of quicker guards, and he can, he gave Anthony Davis hell in that playoff series last year. And even if that's a small sample, it's, their situation was unique because, Neemias Queta was their third, fourth big, right? But he's on a two-way deal. So unless the plan was to guarantee his contract for the rest of the year, he's not playoff eligible. And I I don't think Brad was comfortable going into a playoff run with Horford, Kornet, and Porzingis. You needed sort of like a Grant Williams body type where he's like a tweener big. He can, guard guys in space, but he's strong enough to handle or at least make things tough for the Embiids, the Jokic's, etc. And I think in this system, they're not going to ask him to score. They're going to ask him to be tough, rebound, and defend. And I think, like you said, for some second round picks, like, why wouldn't you want to do that? And obviously, there was a relationship there, given the Grizzlies and Celtics, the Smart deal, all that good stuff. So, on paper, it makes sense, and I'm excited to see what it looks like.
Tillman's efficiency, you mentioned that it's kind of all over the place, obviously, in Memphis, but I will say situation is a big thing with a lot of these things where in Boston, if you're being surrounded by 4 shooters all the time, it's a little bit different than being in Memphis, where shooting is sort of an undersold commodity, is what we'll say. It's been pretty tough out there. But look, I mean, I'm looking at the top 5 plus Horford. Like, you've got the starters in Horford. Then you've got Pritchard and Hauser as options. And you've got Tillman and Springer now as options for a championship rotation. Anybody I'm missing there? Anybody that you think would play?
Yeah, I mean, I think Brissett would probably be that, additional wing, certainly over Springer. I think, what they still lack is that shot creator, like Brissett's an energy guy. Pritchard is Pritchard, he's sort of like an off-ball shooting guard. He's not really creating his own shot. Hauser, catch and shoot guy. So they really don't have a guy where you can say, hey, we're resting one of the Jays or they're in foul trouble. Here's the ball, go get a bucket. They still don't have that guy, right? Like, we don't want to live in a world where you're asking that of O'Shea Brissett. It's just not what he's good at. He's going to crash the glass. He's going to attack closeouts, things like that. So I'd still like to see them, have that option, but they are only going to go 6 or 7, 8 at most deep in a playoff run, barring something catastrophic. So to me, their playoff rotation, I think, is set, but I would like to see Joe Mazzulla just have the option. And that's why it stinks that they couldn't pull something off for like Alani Walker or Sadiq Bey, guys that fit that $6 million trade exemption, just for the option if you need it, if guys are hurt or in foul trouble. So,
well, you mentioned open roster spots still, so there is still time, I guess, for them to fill something like that on the buyout market. I don't really expect a massive bucket getter to be available, especially for the money that I'm sure that Boston will be able to really put out there. But
yeah, I mean, they're limited. They're a second apron team, so they're limited. And if you made over, I think it's like 12.4 mil before your buyout, they can't sign you. So what that is and who that is, I mean, right now we have no idea. But
sorry, you're not going to be able to go get Spencer Dinwiddie, man. It's going to be
you can't get Dinwiddie. You can't get, who was another? There was another guy that was making like 19 or 18 million that they're thinking might get bought out. I can't remember off the top of my head, but historically, buyout guys aren't really difference makers anyways. That's why they're buyout guys.
Sure,
so,
exactly.
I think they addressed a need that I think was more important of the two in terms of big depth or wing depth. So at least they check that box. And now if, a guy sees you as a path to a title, maybe that, helps, that works in your favor. But it wouldn't surprise me if they say, all right, let's just convert Queta, or let's just, have Jordan Walsh be this, extra wing player and see what happens. But, at least they just didn't stand pat. That was the big thing.
Yeah. Wouldn't be the worst idea in the world. I like Walsh. I think he's going to be something down the line if he could just develop some semblance of a jumper.
I mean, he's still so raw, and it's tough. I mean, this is not a developmental season. He plays, in blowouts, and nobody even passes him the ball when he's on the court. So, for him, it's mostly a main season.
What about some other deals around the NBA maybe that caught your eye? Was there anything that went on? The one that comes to mind for me is the New York deal that happened today. They seem to be really building something pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think if you expand it out and include the OG trade, right? Because obviously that was pre-deadline.
Sure.
It's hard not to like what they've done, right? The talent they've brought in is certainly better than the talent they sent out. They didn't give up any first round picks today that that I can remember, right? It was
No,
only
they
seconds.
didn't even give one up for OG.
Right. And I haven't seen all the details, but I saw a tweet from a cat person. They're still under the first apron as of right now. So if someone gets bought out, they can, if it's a Spencer Dinwiddie or someone like they don't have any of the new CBA apron restrictions. So,
Man.
I think the biggest takeaway is this is not your grandfather's dips or whatever that saying is, right? Like they from the Brunson deal to not overpaying for, Donovan Mitchell and just staying the course, their front office is operating as well as any smart organization would. And I think that makes them a legitimate threat, right? They're on this crazy run right now. So they're playing great. They, even if you think that that's defensive based, they added in some good offensive players, and Bogdanovich can get you buckets. Alec Burks is shooting 40% from three. So yeah. I think the Knicks deal stood out. Who else? Who else would I say? Even though it's like, I think the Mavs got better just because they got out of the Grant Williams experience. Like that was going nowhere fast. And even though it sucks that you had to attach a first round pick just to get out of that deal, just from a talent perspective, I think Gafford's a better, backup center than Rashawn Holmes. And I think, TJ Washington, while he's flawed, is better than Grant Williams. So sure. If you're in this window where you need to make sure you're keeping Luka happy and you're making a conscious effort to improve talent, I thought they did that. So, they're a play-in team, not playing, they're right on the border there. So I think that could help them, especially because you had teams like the Lakers and the Warriors not do anything.
Yeah, that was weird.
That was weird. Yeah. I think it's telling, but also they're going to, probably regret that. And I like that, the Wolves got a backup point guard. I think that was a position of need for them. They're sort of slumping right now, so they addressed that, and, we'll see how it shakes out.
A lot of interesting teams, man. A lot of interesting contenders that got better for sure. Boston got better, even if it was on the margins. But I liked what the T-Wolves did. I liked what OKC did, adding Gordon and Hayward.
That's another one. That, to me, that's like the perfect type of we're going for it, but we're not overextending ourselves to do it, right? Yeah, because they have the cap space, they only have to give up, 2 deals, the picks or whatever, because they have 10 million picks. He's a guy that I think, if he's healthy, obviously, right? Like that's the forever Gordon Hayward disclaimer. But if you think about it, now in their closing lineups, they can take out Josh Giddey. They can insert Gordon Hayward. You don't lose any of the playmaking. You don't lose any of the size, but it's a much better shooter, right? Like Giddey's like, I think around 32% this year from three. Hayward's at 36. It just makes them way tougher to guard in a playoff series because, as we know, if you can't shoot, people aren't going to guard you. And that's only going to make things tougher for SGA and Jalen Williams to attack the rim. So, I'm hoping for Hayward's sake, he has sort of like an Al Horford rejuvenation where like guys just seem to go to OKC and come out like, 5 years younger. So, I think that's a needle moving trade for them if he's healthy.
It was smart. It was like a good move. It's a short-term salary move as well. That doesn't really cloud their books in any way, shape, or form. And if it works, then they can re-sign him and maybe ship Giddey off. And there's no problem with that long-term. So the weird one, actually, I didn't really like Kelly Olynyk going to the Toronto Raptors for some reason. I didn't really get that.
I don't really know what the Raptors are doing, right? It's like if you're in a
Bruce Brown too, by the way, like
right, they don't flip Bruce Brown. Like okay, they tell the world we're in a rebuild. They trade OG, they trade Siakam. So you're thinking, okay,
makes sense.
If you're going to rip the Band-Aid off, rip it off, right? You don't need Bruce Brown. If you're going to pick up his option, why wouldn't you keep the other stars that you just traded? And if you're not going to pick up his $23 million option, why are you going to lose this asset for nothing? And I think the same is true for the Dennis Schroeder deal, right? Like they traded him for a guy who they immediately waived. So Schroeder has, I think, at least one or two more years left on his deal.
I think it's
you
one.
didn't even get a second-round pick for that contract. So I just don't really understand their approach, their asset management. Like, what's the plan here? If it's to build around Bruce Brown, well, then why wouldn't you have kept some of your other good veteran players? It's just very confusing.
Yeah, I think if there was one thing I could point to, it's, hey, we have an opportunity to create max cap space in the offseason, but like for who? And like it just doesn't really happen anymore. It doesn't really make sense for where Toronto's at either. So I'm a little bit like weirded out by it, man. Like it just doesn't make any sense. What was there a deal? Was there a deal that didn't happen? Actually, let's go to Philly first. Philly trades for Buddy Hield. It sounds like they're going to get Kyle Lowry as well. They moved Patrick Beverley to the Milwaukee Bucks, who probably should have done more than just get Patrick Beverley, if we're being honest. But really seems like neither of those teams, the Bucks or the Sixers, got better today by a lot.
It's interesting because it all comes down to Joel Embiid for the Sixers, right? Like if he's out for the year, I really don't understand what they did, right?
Right.
If they know that he's going to be back for at least a playoff run, then I like bringing in Buddy Hield to add in some additional shooting and spacing around Embiid. Without Embiid, it's like, what good is it? Hield's an expiring deal. Sure, you're going to have max cap space to potentially keep him. This at least gives you a couple months to get, a look at him in your system. But you're probably going to need that cap space. There's reports now they want to go after Paul George. Well, that's a max deal right there. Yeah. Buddy Hield's not going to go for chump change. So very confusing there. In terms of the Pat Bev trade, it's like, are you better? Like, is campaign, like, what does campaign give you that Pat Bev doesn't?
I think what they're really trying to do there is just free up backup point guard space for Kyle Lowry when he comes in. I assume that that's the plan there, but like, is that really the best use of resources either?
What does the 37-year-old Kyle Lowry give you?
I agree.
Especially if there's no Embiid, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know. So that was very confusing. The Bucks, I think, this is just a product of, their previous trades where they pushed their chips on the table, right? Like, they gave up so many assets for Drew Holiday. They gave up so many assets for Damian Lillard. They gave up 5 second-round picks for Jay Crowder. Like, at some point, you're going to run out of things to trade, especially when nobody really wants your Bobby Portis, your Pat Connaughton, So for them, it's like, okay, great. Pat Bev is a better defender in theory and on paper than Campaign, but they didn't solve their wing defense issue. I still don't think, as much of an upgrade as Pat Bev is as a defender, their point of attack defense, I wouldn't call it solved with this move. So, it's another one of those, you probably just have to hope that, Giannis and Dame can catch fire in a playoff run. But if you look at who they're going to have to guard in the East, what are we seeing on their roster that says, okay, they 100% solidified a problem area at this deadline. Now it's just about getting up to speed with Doc's system. I don't care what your system is. If you're asking Middleton or Jay Crowder or Damian Lillard to guard a Tatum, a Brown, just pick the wings. It's just it's just a matchup problem. And I don't know, they're in a tough spot.
It's going to be fascinating. I think one of the other ways that they lost assets was when they traded Dante DiVincenzo for Serge Ibaka back in the day.
That's another one.
Like, what are you doing? There was no reason for anybody to do that. But I mean, yeah, it's just mismanagement in a lot of ways, and kind of bailed out by the fact that they've had Giannis for a while. But I think that rent is coming due at some point too. So should be fascinating.
Well, I think you almost have to wonder. It's like, hey, we got him to sign the extension. Like, it doesn't matter what, unless he's, I don't foresee him, demanding a trade or anything like that. That would be, I think, a pipe dream of, opposing teams. I just think they were in a spot where the contracts they had to trade didn't have much value to address their needs, and their second round picks, like you said, they had given up so many over these last few off seasons and seasons that they're sort of in a tough spot. And I think Pat Bev was probably the best they could do in terms of a point of attack defender that can sort of make threes every once in a while if he's open as a catch and shoot guy. But he's not that big, right? He's still kind of a
Right.
smallish type player. And their issue is size. Their backcourt is still small. And, I don't know they're under the same sort of apron restrictions for buyout guys as some of the other contenders. So I don't know. I can't say I'm mad at it, but I don't know what they're.
No, I can't believe that.
No.
No, so we'll see what happens. Right now, if you had to pick it, who are the two favorites to come out of the conferences this year?
I'd say obviously the Celts, and I'm going to ride with Cleveland. I'm buying what the Cavs are doing right now. I just think
Okay.
the biggest thing for them that they still have to prove is, can the shooting hold up in a playoff series? Can they still not can they find ways to score when defenses tighten up? That was their issue last year. They were so good during the regular season, they got punched in the mouth and they cratered. I think that's just part of a developmental process, right? You see teams go through stages of development. You have to get your playoff scars. So I think,
Sure.
It wouldn't surprise me if we see a Cavs Celtics Eastern Conference Finals. The same is true for the Knicks, but I just think, the offensive firepower of Donovan Mitchell as a playoff riser, I think he's the best, scoring guard in the conference. I don't know if that's a hot take or not, but he's a handful. In the West, until someone eliminates Denver, I'm always going to pick them. I think, that's just a respect thing. Jokic is still the best player on the planet to me, so, they get my respect, but I mean, OKC, they have that mix of depth, defense, and high-level talent that I think, it may be a year early for them, but on paper, they're devastating.
They probably don't have enough size in general to really ultimately match up with Jokic, but the Clippers is the other team that I look at too.
Yeah, maybe the Clippers instead of OKC. Probably
I mean, they're both. I mean, look, the Thunder have been great all year. There's no doubt that they've earned their spot. Like they are excellent, but I still think that it's probably Denver and the Clippers in the West. But hey, I would love to see the Cavs make a run because if they were able to do something, that'd be great. But I'm still probably thinking Denver Boston in the finals after this, and that's going to be a war. It's going to be an absolute war, man.
I don't think that's a hot take, and I think their game earlier, about a month ago. I think if that was a finals preview, I think you and I are in for a very stressful series.
Yeah,
because
it's gonna be crazy.
It's like they can't stop Jokic. Murray's crazy, but do the Nuggets have the wing defenders to I just think it would be a very fun series, and I think we were robbed of it last year. So I certainly wouldn't hate it. Obviously, I've lived in Colorado before. I have an affinity for the Nuggets. I'm a Jokic stan and Jokic believer, but I would hope the Celtics won that in 4, unfortunately.
Believe it. Certainly do, because hey, anytime it gets closer to 5, 6, or 7, I know y'all are going to be sweating. So it's definitely true. So we will see what happens. But hey, any final thoughts on the trade deadline before we get out of here?
I want to ask you this. Do you think this is, this was more of a depth fringe add around the margins type deadline? Do you think, given the new CBA and the play-in, that this is our future now? Like, gone are the days of like huge names being moved at the deadline. It's more going to be just these like depth pieces and lower tier moves.
I'm not sure. I honestly think it's just cyclical, where last year we had a lot of star movement. We had a lot of guys like Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving and different other stars that moved around. And we've had that for a long, long time. And while I do think that it's probably more likely that things aren't going to happen at the trade deadline, it's more like starters and more role players, it's kind of always like that. It's very rare for these stars to get moved right at the deadline unless there's a massive like pressure point that's being put onto some of these teams. So I got to imagine that it's going to be more like a cyclical thing, where the next star that's like disgruntled at the trade deadline is probably going to get moved then too.
Yeah, I would say that free agency is the same way, right? Like now it's much more likely that someone's going to sign an extension and demand a trade than actually hit the free agent market. So it's interesting. I mean, I think we're all still glued to our phones, right? We're all waiting for every
No doubt
Woj
about
and
it.
Sims bomb, but I don't know. This year kind of just felt like, all right, like this is nice. Like it's okay, but I'm just ready for post All-Star break. Everyone's gonna get serious, and obviously it's a run to the title. So
It's about to get very real for a lot of people and a lot of fans. But hey, always looking forward to it. And I think that this is where everybody can kind of turn the page and say, look, now it's time to get serious, as you said. So should be a lot of fun. But he is Dan Greenburg of Barstool Sports. Make sure to go check out all of his Boston Celtics coverage. Dan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk Celtics and other teams, man.
appreciate it, man.